Welcome to the CEC Report for the 5th of February 2016. I'm Elisa Barwick and joining me today is Robert Barwick. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks, Elisa.
And on today's show, negative interest rates are no solution. More look to Glass-Steagall. And sudden allegations against Putin cooked up by British smear machine. So firstly today, negative interest rates are no solution. More look to Glass-Steagall. Now, the new phase of the financial crash that is underway, and we've been reporting on for a little while, has suddenly put Glass-Steagall on the map, including in the Australian media over the last week or so, and we'll come back to reporting on that. But firstly, by way of background on the latest developments in the crash, and particularly in the transatlantic financial system, bail-in, which is the idea whereby to keep a bank functioning you confiscate people's deposits and various kinds of bonds and investments, was supposed to be the new great solution for Europe, and they implemented the Bank Recovery and Resolution Directive on the 1st of January, whereby all the EU countries agreed to go along with bail-in.
So now, and they say now they've got these buffers, which is our savings basically, and that'll keep the system going under any circumstances. That's what they'd like the public to believe.
Yeah, supposedly. That's the line that's been put out. But already it's been shown to be a failure because in Europe, as we'll show, they've had to resort again to the old-fashioned methods of bailout together with bail-in, and also a new round. There's a big push now for a new round of quantitative easing. And that's already been pushed forward in the case of Japan, which has now gone to negative interest rates. They had a positive 0.1 rate, now they're at a negative 0.1 rate. Now on the 20th of January, the central bank chief of Japan, Kuroda, had said that there was no way he was going to go into negative interest rate territory, but he went to the Davos World Economic Forum, and there the European Central Bank President Mario Draghi, together with the governor of the US Federal Reserve, Stanley Fischer, put his arm behind his back and talked him into it. So all government bonds up to 10 years in maturity now have 0% or below interest rate in Japan, and this is the same now in Germany, Sweden, Denmark and Switzerland. They've all got those negative rates, and basically the only buyer of their government debt instruments now is their own central bank. So
yeah, the central bank is giving the government extra money for the right to lend money to the government. That's what negative interest rates are. And this is a flow-on effect from what we called last December, just before Christmas, when Janet Yellen raised interest rates in America. They raised them for the first time in 7 years. And we said on this program that this is done under an illusion. And the illusion is, the economic statistics say the crisis is over. There is a recovery, right? And we said, no, there's not. Wait to see the flow-on effect, wait to see this rip through the system, and that's what's happened ever since. And so now everyone is saying, that experiment's failed, we have to go backtrack, drop interest rates to worse than zero, right, negative, and let's pump in more money.
But this is having implications of freezing up the outflow of credit into the regular economy, and the Financial Times of the 31st of January quoted one banker who put it this way. He said, "We're headed for a zero world. Zero rates, zero per capita growth, and zero productivity."
Because what people have to understand is this has nothing to do with your everyday economic life if you're a small business person or someone trying to function in an economy. These are purely measures to keep banks afloat. This is a financial system looking after itself.
It's become completely insular.
It is. And the rest of the real economy on a day-to-day basis doesn't matter. Right? And so this is going to do nothing for that. Nothing for productivity, nothing for economic growth, only to desperation measure keep bad financial paper propped up.
Now let's look at the case of Italy, because this is a specific case where they had a bail-in December. 4 commercial banks were bailed in, and they now have already had to go back to including a bailout, although it's not technically being called a bailout, and we'll explain why. But what happened is that in the last week, the Italian government made a deal with the European Commission whereby the Italian banks will take the bad debt off their books, and it's estimated to be 30 to 40% of all loans that are bad in the Italian finance sector.
Which is, put in perspective, Italy is a much bigger economy than Greece, than Spain, Portugal, and the other problem country of Ireland. Italy is a very big industrial economy. To have 30 to 40% of bank loans being non-performing, that's a huge deal.
Mm-hmm. So what this deal allows is for the bad loans to be bundled up into packages, and the government is going to sell insurance contracts on those packages of bad debt, which takes the form of a credit default swap. And those credit default swaps can then be sold. There's already hedge funds and what they call vulture funds that are circling to buy it up. And what they do is they buy it up, for cents on the dollar. But when that debt is eventually defaulted on, which is what they tried in Argentina, they demand the full value of those debts.
Yeah. So in this case, why it's a bailout by the government is just so people are clear. The government is functioning as the insurance company, right? And so the analogy that's a good one is, the government knows this debt is bad, yet it's willing to sell insurance to insure that debt, even though they know it's bad. That insurance claim, it's going to have to pay it out. So it's like an insurance company seeing a house burning down, right, and coming up to the owner and saying, "I will sell you insurance on your house burning down." Well, of course the owner is going to buy that insurance because you can't lose, right? That's what the Italian government has just done. It's a bailout. By any other name, and it's insane. And the analogy, like for those who've watched the movie The Big Short, and if you haven't watched it, go to the cinema and watch it. It's the same type of bet that these people who bet against the mortgages were being able to buy from these big banks. But the difference was those big banks who initially sold that bet didn't believe they'd ever have to pay it out. In this case, the Italian government knows they'll have to pay it out.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
It's nuts.
So we're going back to doing exactly the same thing that actually caused the 2007-2008 crisis, and somehow we think that this is going to solve our problems this time. It's insane. Now, on other updates on the bail-in drive, the Russian Finance Ministry is looking at an option to bail in deposits over 100 million rubles. That's about 128,000 US dollars. In Spain, Bankia, which is the bank that was bailed in 2013, may now have to pay back 800 million euro because it was found they had serious inaccuracies in the brochure that advertised their stock market launch. So this led to massive investor losses, which people didn't understand that would make. So that is a big question mark hanging over Bankia. Deutsche Bank is being described as being in free fall. Their shares are down 30% so far this year, which is just a month. And there was also an article this week in the Business Spectator on the 4th of February which talked about the oil derivatives bubble and referred to the fact that it's not just the oil collapse, but it's the derivatives bubble based upon that. And of course, you've seen in the last week Standard & Poor's and Moody's cutting the credit ratings of some of the world's biggest mining and commodities cartels, including BHP Billiton, Freeport-McMoran, Chevron, Shell, and the list goes on.
So what this article in The Spectator pointed out, Elisa, is that when the crash happened in 2007-8 on the back of the mortgage bubble, about $500 billion was lost on US mortgages. That was the actual losses on mortgages. But the derivatives on those mortgages amplified those losses into total loss of $7 trillion from global GDP and ultimately $28 trillion from global equity markets, which is share market losses on the back of that, right? So what was a $500 billion loss in real investments turned into those much bigger losses. And the comparison is, when it comes to oil, the amount that's probably at risk in the oil market right now is anywhere from 1.7 trillion to 4 trillion, which there's all these derivatives on. And so that's much bigger than that 500 billion, right? And therefore the potential amplified losses going through the system are going to be much, much, much bigger again. So when they make the movie, the sequel to The Big Short about the 2007 crash, about this one today, the word big will have to be changed, like the humongous short, the gigantic short, the astronomical short, whatever it'll be. This is a huge problem that's happening as we speak.
And of course the real issue is that after that 2007-08 crash, we didn't look at the causality, we didn't deal with that, we didn't implement Glass-Steagall.
Sorry, we did.
We did.
The powers,
we looked
the
at
powers
it,
that be didn't.
The powers that be didn't, and it wasn't implemented.
The criminal bankers stayed in charge, and that's what's got to change this time.
Yeah, so after the break, we're going to talk about the upsurge in discussion of Glass-Steagall that's taking place in the last period. Welcome back to the CEC Report. We're discussing negative interest rates are no solution. More look to Glass-Steagall. Now, on last week's show, we reported, this is by way of contrast to the Glass-Steagall discussion, that at the Sydney Opera House last Friday night, our Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull met with leading bankers and hedge fund operators, and this was an event that was hosted by Citigroup.
Yeah. These were representatives of the biggest investment managers in the world, including the biggest, Blackwater, which controls about $4 trillion worth of investment. And it was very exclusive. I think they call it the A50 or something meeting. So it was Turnbull, his chief ministers, and the key department heads, and the head of the Reserve Bank and APRA. And I was surprised by those two being there because they're supposed to be independent authorities, statutory authorities, right? They shouldn't be part of any kind of government initiative on anything. They're just supposed to be supervising how the system works. They were there as well, and even the head of the Reserve Bank hosted one of these, the dinner or something. We called it in our press release the money power, right? This is Australia kissing the butt of the money power, none of which is necessary, but it's how the system works. And we're supposed to believe this is going to be some kind of saviour for the Australian economy, when, of course, there's a much better way.
Which is Glass-Steagall. Now, 3 days after that Friday gathering, this Monday just gone, there was another conference that was held by the CFA Society, which is the Chartered Financial Analysts, and this was also in Sydney. And they featured a British economist who's a professor at the London School of Economics, and he's a columnist for the Financial Times, Professor John Kay. And he called for Glass-Steagall. Now, he mapped out that just regulating and putting new rules in place, including new liquidity measures like the Basel discussions are about, and the things that were proposed by our financial system inquiry last year, those kind of regulations will not actually prevent a new crisis. So he said that we must force banks to actually separate their retail and investment banking activities. He talked about the fact that there's a type of banking which is rather boring, where you don't look out for big profits, you just want your money to be safe. And there was an article commenting on this in the Sydney Morning Herald on February the 2nd by Ross Gittins, where it was headlined, "Banks are using us to hedge their bets." And just to give you an idea, and then I'll ask you to talk about it, Robert, this is what he had to say, his summary of what Professor John Kay said in his speech. He said, "We need a finance sector to service the needs of the real economy, of households and businesses producing and consuming goods and services. But none of this justifies the huge growth in the financial sector we've seen. Most of that growth has come in the form of massively increased trading between the banks themselves in financial claims, such as shares and bonds and foreign currencies and derivatives, claims on claims, and even, if you've seen The Big Short, claims on claims on claims. If you add together all the financial assets or claims owned by all the banks and other financial outfits, they exceed by many times the value of the physical assets, such as houses and business buildings and equipment, which are the ultimate basis for all those claims." So, he is basically saying that all speculative activity is socially unproductive, that only 3% of lending goes into the real economy. But isn't this exactly what we've been saying, and of which, there's a graph that we've developed back in 1994, which you can see in this week's Australian Alert Service, to describe exactly this phenomenon?
Yeah, well, this particular image that you can see, it was put out by Lyndon LaRouche in 1994 to illustrate the point that Ross Gittins was making in that quote you just read. And what I was surprised, what surprised me most about Gittins' article is it's like he just discovered it. We were saying this with LaRouche in 1994. Someone should, go to the CEC's website or look up the history of the CEC's publication, The New Citizen. Look at how many times we said, this is the problem in the system. It's this derivatives cancer. It's not the real economy. There's a disconnect, as the image shows, Physical economic output is moving away from financial aggregates, right? And it's going to crash. It has to. There's no avoiding that crash.
And even in 1994, the Australian Financial Review even quoted our warnings explicitly on derivatives.
Exactly, because we knew that the point of derivatives is they are disconnected from the real world, but they are assigned all this value. Now, the thing with John Kay, Elisa, is he's no more qualified than us to call for Glass-Steagall. Yes, he's an economics professor, etc. But our experience over more than 20 years is what qualifies us. We are the experts in this subject. All these people are jumping on the bandwagon now, which is good, and it's good that the media is paying attention to it. But hey, just wake up and listen to the CEC once in a while, right? You'll be ahead of the curve, we can assure you. Kay went on to call for Glass-Steagall explicitly. Separate banking, right? Separate banking from gambling. That's what Glass-Steagall is. Here's gambling, here's banking, have nothing to do with each other. And if you want your money safe, put it in banking, not gambling. He also made the point that is relevant to Australians in another way, which you can look at when you see a graph of our banks and the big four banks and their derivatives, that the way this system works is when you use derivatives, you can count future profits now, but put off counting present losses until the future. And that's the way you can exaggerate your profits. And this is quite an insight into the Australian banking system, because we have an economy that's hitting the skids. The resource sector is blowing, the resource boom's gone. All our manufacturing infrastructure and production has just been allowed to be destroyed, right? We're losing the car industry, etc. Yet our banks, since the global financial crisis, have made a profit, record profits, bigger each year than the year before. What is the economy they're making those profits out of? It doesn't make sense, except their derivatives are going up faster than their profits. Right? They're private banks. We don't have any insight into their particular books, except the suspicion is they're cooking them using these methods. And Kay made a similar observation about the system in general. We're saying that probably applies to our system in particular.
And a crucial precedent to the Glass-Steagall Act initially coming in was the Pecora Commission in 1933, and it was very revealing, and people should read up on it. There's some very good books that discuss this, because it went through in meticulous detail analysing what the banks had done and what they did wrong and all of the corrupt practices. But it also made clear that there were plenty of rules and regulations, but they were able to get around them. And unless you actually make it illegal for deposit-taking banks to speculate in any form, whether it be through some holding company or because they're very good at finding ways to get around. There was a British lord who, in the debate during 2013 where they discussed ring fencing versus Glass-Steagall, he said, look, these bankers are very adept at getting between the walls and the wallpaper. If there's a way to do it, they will do it. So you have to actually make it illegal.
And I'll just mention briefly now, we'll talk about this more in coming weeks, but we've just discovered this week that because Australia doesn't have Glass-Steagall and we're going down this bail-in path, that for the last few years, our banks have already been selling to retail customers what are called bail-in securities that are very complicated, and the buyers, probably the super funds that you've got, that our viewers have their money in, the buyers who buy these think they're getting a high interest rate on these bail-in bonds. They don't know how complicated they are, such that if the minute the bank gets into trouble, these bonds are going to become worthless. And the banks have been selling a lot of them, and there's a group of senior academic economists in Australia who, October 2015, just 3 months ago, made a big deal about this, saying this is a real problem, that people are probably being set up to lose money by the banks. And that's exactly what Pecora went after in 1933, because that's what the banks did then. They made sure the losses they made in the crash were distributed off to ordinary people, so the bankers could keep going, and they're doing the same thing again. We'll talk about that more in future weeks.
Yep, and after the break, we're going to talk about the latest on the war front. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Sudden allegations against Putin cooked up by British smear machine. So always we can see that with a financial crash escalation comes a war escalation, and it's particularly dramatic at the moment and worrisome because the collaboration between elements inside the United States led by Secretary of State John Kerry together with the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov have made crucial headway to create peace in Syria, and they've just cut off crucial lines of support and access between Turkey and Syria. So this is making good progress, but just in the last couple of weeks we had the flashing headlines across the top of all the Australian media, Robbie, about how Putin was probably behind the assassination of the Russian former Soviet spy living in London, Alexander Litvinenko, in 2006.
Probably.
Yeah, it was all probably he was involved, probably.
And the whole report says that, probably. So, and this is something that we have to talk about to give our viewers an insight into how the system works, because when I saw that, I realised straight away, I mean, our media just makes itself available as an organ of absolute propaganda, right?
I would never normally report anything that happens in Russia.
Well, the project, which is the lightweight 10 on 10 news program, it started off with that as its lead item. I'm thinking, wasn't there a cat up a tree today or something, right? Wasn't there some celebrity who flashed a petticoat? No, it was Putin probably did this. So we've looked at the report, and it's probably is every second word in this report. They have nothing. They made a big deal about something they got no evidence of whatsoever, right? And you can look at the report itself. But what we could quickly see is that this was the product of a very well-organised smear and cover-up machine that does the bidding of the British Crown, right? This is the way the British system operates. I mean, it's not just British. This kind of thing happens in Australia. They have these kind of cover-ups and smears all the time, or the US, etc. But the Brits are particularly good at it, right? So what we saw is that the judge that everyone saw on TV, Justice Robert Owen, who handed down this report. So he's the public face of the inquiry. Behind him is the secretary to the inquiry, the faceless guy you never see, the chief bureaucrat doing the work for this inquiry. His name is Lee Hughes, QC. And young Lee Hughes, I don't know how young he is, Mr. Lee Hughes has a history. He was the secretary to the inquiry of some other inquiries, which, you know, tell you what sort of person he is. The most notable one was the Hutton inquiry. The Hutton inquiry was an inquiry into the death of the British Weapons Inspector David Kelly, who was the first person to say that Tony Blair lied about weapons of mass destruction. He was the source of this claim that the Blair government had sexed up the claims of weapons of mass destruction. He was publicised as the source of that. A few days later, he winds up dead. They held this inquiry to go out of their way to say, oh, it was just a suicide, right? Whereas the body was moved before they found it and all kinds of things. That was a total cover-up. Lee Hughes was the secretary to that inquiry. Lee Hughes was also the secretary to the inquest into Princess Diana and Dodi El-Fayed's death. Now that inquest, to its credit, found that they were the victims of an unlawful killing, quote unquote, which basically means a murder, but you don't know who did it. But that was the jury found that. The people around the inquiry told the jury not to make that finding. They did anyway. They rigged it so the royal family didn't have to testify, etc. Lee Hughes was the secretary to that inquiry, and now he's the secretary to this inquiry, which makes these big headlines. Putin is probably a murderer. Here's another excuse for World War III.
And they did give other alternatives. They did say he was informing on the Russian mafia, so that was a possibility. He could have been killed by then.
At the same time, Lisa, the BBC did a total hatchet job on Putin as he's worth $40 billion. He steals from everybody. It's just all propaganda that came out in the context of these developments internationally around Syria.
It was called Putin's Secret Riches. But for more on all of that, it's in this week's alert service. Call in for a free copy. Thanks for joining us again this week. Thanks, Robert. And tune in again next week for the CEC Report.